Here we are, different scenery, different background, and I've decided to move away from the camera to give you a break from my face. But hopefully you'll be able to hear this, because we are part and parcel of momentous events, which, as all events have a historical precedent. Australia's always had a problem. Since the colonisation process began, we have felt that we were a European enclave in an Asian landmass. And because of the racist policies that were pursued by European imperial powers for the previous 500 years, there was a great fear that this European enclave in Australia, which had been won by the dispossession of the original inhabitants through an exceptionally brutal colonisation process, which led to almost the extermination of the original inhabitants, that somehow, as a nation state, we had to protect ourselves from the fact that we're a European enclave in an Asian landmass. So the whole history of Australia since 1788 has been about protecting this European incursion into Australia. And it's no accident that when the Australian Federation was formed on the 1st of January 1901, the first pieces of legislation through federal parliament were about enacting the White Australia policy and enacting policies which saw the deportations of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Kanaks who'd been brought across as slaves to work on the sugarcane plantations in Queensland and New South Wales. So we need to understand the mentality of what the Pentecostal warmonger Morrison has just done and what his cabinet has done. And don't think that we haven't been prepared for this. As a nation, we've been softened up for this particular moment with the anti-Chinese rhetoric, which has been part and parcel of the everyday political program of the Liberal National Party, which is based on the concept that if they can induce fear in the community, we will once again re-elect them despite their flaws. So this is basically a re-election strategy, but this time it has a profound impact for generations to come. Because what we've done is we've seen two bullies in the world, the United States government and the Chinese government, trying to vie for supremacy. One is a rising power, the Chinese state. Another one is a waning power, the United States, which is internally divided on a number of important fracture lines. And we, because of our European heritage, have decided to tag along for the ride with the United States, in a move which was described by the Chinese authorities as irresponsible. So why? Now, this is nothing new. The fear of the yellow peril, whether it's Chinese Communist Party or a Chinese government, has always been part and parcel of the backbone of the moral and ethical concerns in this country. And we've seen since the gold rushes in the 1850s and the 1860s. But it's been brought to a new level since World War II. Now, just in case you think the fact that we've now cemented this alliance with the United States is anything new, we need to go back into history. When World War I was declared in August 1914, the Labor Prime Minister promised to support the British Empire to the last shilling and the last man, without consulting the people of this country. Fortunately for him, the war hysteria, pushed along by a media and a ruling class that was quite happy to sacrifice other people's children for their own economic gain, there was huge support for Australia's intervention in World War I. The only forces against that intervention were the radical forces from the industrial workers of the world, a radical workplace group that had anti-racist and anti-hierarchical viewpoints. They're about the only voice in this vast country of over 5 million. And people volunteered day after day after day till 420,000 young Australian men from a population of 5 million volunteered to fight in the war to end walls. As the war continued and the death toll mounted in a 20th century horror film, the Australian people, led by elements of the trade union movement, the women's movement, sections of the Catholic Church, began to campaign against the war. And when the Billy Hughes-led Labor government was asked to provide more men and introduce conscription into Australia, the Prime Minister Hughes divided the Labor Party on that question and joined the Conservative opposition for about 1/3 of the members of the Labor Party and the Cabinet to pursue that agenda. But faced with the problem of a general strike among sections of the trade union movement regarding the question of conscription, the Prime Minister was forced to hold a referendum on the question of conscription. That first referendum in December 1916 was defeated by the Australian people, who refused to conscript young men who did not want to fight in this war overseas to die on the European killing fields, because by then the casualty rate was so horrendous that people understood the nature of modern warfare. A second referendum in late 1917 to introduce conscription was also defeated. So the great heroes of the World War I were those men and women who stood up in the anti-conscription struggle, who ensured that not one extra human being, not one extra young Australian was sacrificed on the European killing fields for the glory of God, King and country. Not democracy, not freedom, but the glory of God, King and country, fought by workers at either end of a bayonet for a dirty little trade war for the European ruling classes. Having learnt that lesson, Australia began to develop a more independent defence policy. And during World War II, we saw some of the most important battles of the region, and how the Australian troops, the Australian Labor Prime Minister, was forced to call back forces which had been sent to aid the British war effort in the Middle East back to Australia to defend Australia against the Japanese invasion. So with United States support and local support, we were able to stop that advance. But after World War II, believing that the only way to ensure that this European enclave, or European-dominated enclave in Asia, continued to survive and flourish, was to hitch our wagon to the anti-Chinese campaigns, which were a daily feature of political life in this country. Mr Menzies, the Liberal Prime Minister, won federal election after federal election after federal election post-World War II on the basis of formulating fear in the population about this Asian invasion. And we saw Australia's involvement in the Malaysian emergency We saw Australia's invasion in the Vietnam War. When Lyndon Johnson came to Australia, I think it was in '64, and the slogan by the Australian Prime Minister at that particular point in time was "all the way with LBJ." And we saw the introduction of conscription, and we saw an anti-conscription struggle once again be created in this country, and we saw young men and women being sent to Vietnam to fight other people's war overseas as a blood sacrifice for the United States alliance. And since then, since conscription was abolished, I think it was in 1970, we have seen various Liberal National Party governments tie themselves to the United States coattail in the invasion of Iraq and the horrendous results that have occurred as a result of that invasion with the rise of the Taliban and Islamic State and Muslim fundamentalists. We saw it in the 20-year war in Afghanistan, and we saw it in Korea. And we've seen failure after failure after failure after failure pursuing this policy. But not to be influenced by historical precedent, our Christian Pentecostal Prime Minister has now put this country in the firing line. In the firing line. We have become a proxy for the United States in the Southern Hemisphere. If you think that the unimaginable can't happen, if you think this blood sacrifice by successive Australian governments has somehow tightened the Australian, US and British alliance, think again. Who cut and run out of Vietnam when the price became a little bit too high? The US government. Who has cut and run out of most of the Middle East? The US government. Who has cut and run out of Afghanistan? The US government. So if you think if a future United States president had to make a decision about whether to support Australia, the man down under, the Pentecostal warmonger Morrison and his cabinet, or look after the needs of a fractured United States, where do you think they would cut and run from? They would cut and run from this country. And if you think the era of proxy wars is over, think again and think how Africa was laid to waste in proxy wars between Russia and the United States in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. Think again. And if you think our geographical isolation protects us from nuclear attack or ballistic attack from other sources, think again. I mean, this policy of hitching our wagon to the United States and thinking that somehow they will fight to the last man and the last shilling to protect us is ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. But unfortunately, as at the beginning of World War I in August 1914, most Australians support the expansion of this alliance. Most Australians continue to support the expansion of Australia's military and nuclear capabilities. Most Australians continue to support the deployment of more and more and more United States troops, Japanese troops, Korean troops on this continent for joint exercises, and an increasing number of United States troops permanently based in Northern Australia. This is a pivotal moment in Australian history, and we have allowed it to occur. Under the cover of a COVID-19 pandemic, where the state has exercised its power to curtail the ability of people to protest. It has now foisted this nuclear submarine deal with the United States military-industrial complex on us. At the same time, it has opened the gate to United States intervention in this country. So if you think that people like you and me, who may have a more radical assessment of the situation, are safe because United States troops are here again, think again. This United States deployment is not just about protecting the Australian people from external aggression. It's ultimately about maintaining the status quo. It's ultimately about ensuring the resources which are controlled by a handful of corporations continue to be controlled by a handful of corporations. Don't forget the lesson of 1975, when the Whitlam Labor government was thrown out of office courtesy of the CIA and the United States government. Think about it. Do you think they would allow you or me to be involved in a movement that wants to reclaim our birthright? Do you think they'd want us to continue to be able to function in a society where we wish to enter into treaties with this country's First Nations people in terms of this country's natural resources? Do you think they would stomach the nationalisation of this country's resources into the hands of the government of the day? Do you think they would support democratisation in this country and the evolution of a constitution which incorporates our fundamental human rights in that constitutional framework? Do you think it's going to be business as usual? Today I've changed the scenery. It's much more pleasant. You can hear the ocean lapping, the wind blowing, but behind us are trees that have died. And that's what the Morrison-led Liberal National Coalition has done. In its quest to win the next federal election, it has sacrificed this country's future. Ask yourself, how many children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, sons and daughters, grandparents, aunts and uncles, friends, workmates, work colleagues, are you willing to sacrifice to ensure the current domination of our society by a small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication continues? Ask yourself, are you willing to make that sacrifice? And if you're not, it's time that you joined organisations like Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, whose agenda is about ensuring that we are more than a European-dominated enclave in a hostile Asian world.